This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. Hello and welcome to another edition of Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast, where we love talking about clubs that are in trouble and then getting them out of trouble. And today's a really interesting one because it's a very general topic about what can get clubs into trouble in the first. In fact, it's probably the most important thing that can get clubs into trouble in the first place. My name's Michael Connolly, and joining me as usual is my brother, Steve Connolly. G'day, Steve. How are you doing today?
Hello. Very well, thanks. Really looking forward to communicating with you today, Mick.
Oh, nice one. Yes, it's communication. And it's what can go. So this is really funny, Steve. It's really often that when we're talking about, doing a typical SWOT analysis, all the good things that clubs do, which is typically a short list because we're all too humble. Then we get to our weaknesses and it's this great big long list of things that we say, oh, we're really shit at that. And so that's the weaknesses list. And it's so common that people put communication up there as a weakness or as a threat or as a strategy itself. We've got to fix our communication. But to me, I've always thought that communication is very rarely the disease itself. To me, I think communication is more a symptom of the underlying disease. So then it's important to dig deep and find out what that disease is. And it could probably be categorized as one of three things. The first one is I don't want to tell. The second one, I don't want to listen. And the third one, I don't want to ask. So the first one I don't want to tell is a power play. It's I'm the boss. I know something that you don't, and I'm going to keep it to myself. So the second one, I don't want to listen, means you know something that I don't know, and you've told me, but it goes against my beliefs or my arguments or really where I want to position myself in this whole thing. And so I don't listen to you, or sometimes I even pretend you haven't told me. And the third one, and this is probably the worst, I don't want to ask. I know you know something, or you may know something, you may have a question, but if I don't ask you and I never find out, then I have plausible deniability. So it's kind of saying you are responsible for reading my mind and telling me the answers to everything that you might know that I don't know, that you should assume that I don't know. And that just doesn't work, and it's really dangerous. Does that accord with the sort of stuff that you get to see as well?
Yes, it certainly does. And it's funny, as you're talking, I'm thinking about all the different scenarios that lead people to display those sorts of hesitations to communicating, and it's a really easy thing for clubs to point to as the cause of all of their woes, but it's often, as you're saying, a little more complicated than that. And I'm even thinking about relationships from organizations or at the club level with their regional, state or national organizations, and it's we'll often hear people say, oh, they don't do anything for us. We never hear from them, or we get bombarded. So the really important messages just get lost in the noise. It's such a common fallback position, is to say, communication's no good in this sport, in our club. The handover was crap. We didn't get given what we needed from the previous management committee. So communications failed us there. But very rarely do I come across people with a really clear understanding of what needs to be done to fix that problem. It's this unsolvable problem that we can point to and just get on with burying our head in the sand and focusing on the day-to-day stuff, rather than actually trying to uncover the cause of that issue and solve the problem for the long term.
Yeah, I like that. Just bury your head in the sand by being busy. And say, oh, well, we can't fix it, so we'll just go and do what we do and pretend that problem doesn't exist. And then what's going to happen? Is it going to get better on its own?
And do the urgent stuff. The best head burying that I see, particularly in sporting clubs, is, making sure that the field's well presented, making sure the kids have got playing uniforms, making sure all of those things that are going to lead to members communicating with us angrily. You don't do a good enough job of organising jerseys on time. So it's a really easy thing to consume a lot of time by just being busy on the make work or the urgent stuff, rather than actually focusing on fixing problems like this that can solve long-term issues in clubs.
Yep. So communication is a big one, and you've brought up how big it can get. So communication up the line when we're talking about up to our regional, state, and national associations, but also communication down the line from the managers of an organisation down to the members or the constituents. So the purpose of this discussion is really about the communication within the committee itself, particularly the communication within a committee at committee meetings. Because when you're in a committee, just in a committee meeting in particular, it's really the job of the meeting is there to give you the safety to talk in among people of among peers of equals, and where the meeting itself gives you the protection to be able to speak your mind, and you're speaking your mind about what's best for the club, not what's best for me. And so that's the way that every committee meeting should be run. So here's the analogy: a bad committee meeting, or bad committee meetings and bad communications, are like bad communication on the flight deck of an aeroplane. Modern airlines don't crash very often. So there's been a few recent cases. Obviously, the Malaysia Airlines ones a few years ago were particularly close to home. But the airplanes themselves are incredibly well maintained. You think about the servicing that you've got to do on your new car just to keep the warranty. These are freaking things that fly in the air. So the maintenance work is incredible. They have a certain number of hours now, regardless of whether the Rolls-Royce jet engine hanging under the wing of some Boeing or Airbus airplane is fine. Once it's reached its hours, or it's getting near its hours, boom, it comes off and is completely overhauled. And it's just safety first, safety first, safety first. That's the way that it is. So I'd like to draw an analogy here between what happens on an aeroplane and what happens in a club committee meeting. So if you like, the flight crew of an airline is like our committee. We've got a president, the pilot. We've got a navigator, who in our committee is the secretary. We've got a first officer, the vice president, and of course we've got a treasurer, probably the person who took your money to buy the tickets in the first place. But you can see the parallels there, and you can also see the risk of power struggles. And this is where the analogy is really interesting. And when communication, because of these power struggles, poor communication because of these power struggles, leads to catastrophe. So just let me tell you a quick one here. There was an Air Florida crash in 1982. Now, it shouldn't have happened, Steve. The first officer, because he was the first officer and not the pilot, not the captain, felt that he was subservient to the captain. So when he had significant concerns for the safety of the aircraft, and of course all of the people on it, including his own bum, he didn't speak up clearly enough. He used what we call is mitigated speech. So when I say, when I want you to do something, Steve, can you get me that email by 2:00 this afternoon? That's clear and unambiguous. I've asked you what to do and I've given you a strict deadline. But if I'm using mitigated speech, I might say, Steve, look, I know that you've got a lot on your plate, but if you've got a chance to have a look at this by 2 and get it back to me, that'd be great. So notice that I'm saying the same thing, but I'm saying it a lot softer. And it gets worse and worse and worse the further away. And I think I'm communicating clearly, but I'm actually using mitigated speech where you're not hearing what I'm trying to say.
And how often do we hear people in the volunteer world using that sort of language when they're speaking with each other? Because it's not an employment environment. It's not do your job, reach your KPIs, otherwise you lose your job and don't get paid.
Yep.
In the volunteer world, people are often a lot more sensitive and I don't want to upset them because we might lose them as a volunteer. So I think just the nature of interpersonal communication in committees, typically, we've got a pretty low base to start with in terms of our willingness to speak frankly.
Yeah. So these stories now are going to be pretty harsh. And what I want you to take away from them is that exactly what you just said, Steve. Don't feel that you need to use that sort of speech just because you're mitigating your speech just because you're worried that you might upset someone. Like, you've got to be really clear in your communication. So for those of you who aren't clear in your communication and you're seeing things not happen, the job for you is to step it up, to be more clear in your communication. If you're then on the other side, if you're one of these people who says, oh yeah, he's a pretty good president, but he's a bit polarizing, he's very blunt. Take that bluntness in the spirit that it is being delivered, in clarity and getting rid of ambiguity. That is how you should take it. If you are then going to step up, or if you are one of those people that people say is very blunt, then instead of using mitigated speech, just give yourself permission to use clear speech at the beginning and say, I'm going to speak clearly. I understand that we're all volunteers here, but I'm speaking clearly because ambiguity leads to disaster. And obviously disaster on a flight deck of an aeroplane is far worse than disaster in a football club or a netball club. But it still means that people are spending time fixing problems that they don't need to fix in the first place. So have a listen to this little excerpt from this Air Florida flight, not fright. It was probably pretty scary at the time. It's taking off outside from Washington, D.C., and it was cold. And so the first officer on the flight deck of an aeroplane is looking at all of the other planes taking off before them. And he's looking at all of the ice building up on the wings. Now, when ice builds up on the wing of an aeroplane, all of the things that you see move when the plane takes off and lands, so the flaps, the ailerons, the air brakes, they're going to freeze over and they're not going to be able to function. So the first officer, instead of saying to the captain, hey, dude, I'm scared about taking off because there's a lot of ice on the wings and the plane's in front of us. We've been on the ground for too long since they've done anything to de-ice our wings. It's so cold out there that the ice is going to build up and our shit's not going to work. That's what he should have said. Have a listen to what he did say. He said, oh, look how the ice is just hanging on. Here's a back there. See that? So he's pointing to the back of another airplane. Then the next one, oh, see all those icicles on the back there and everything? That's literally what he said. This is from the transcript of the flight data, the voice flight recorder. The next one, boy, this is a losing battle here on trying to de-ice those things. It gives you a false feeling of security. That's all that does. Oh my God.
Wow.
Like, I know how this story ends, so I've got goosebumps already. And finally, as they get clearance for takeoff, the first officer, he just steps it up a bit and he says, let's check those wing tops again since we've been sitting here a while. So that's the first time just before he takes off. But then the captain comes back and says, oh, no, I think we can go here in a minute. So it's about to be their turn to take off. Now, the only time that this first officer got clear in his speech was the last thing that you hear on the flight data recorder was, Larry, we're going down, Larry. And then from the captain, I know it. And that was just before the plane crashed into the Potomac River. It's just so hard to tell that story without getting emotional, because you just think, oh, if only he'd said something, if only he'd spoken up. Now, there's plenty of other stories that I don't think I need to go into because they are exactly the same. They just go a bit longer. Yeah. So instead of giving you another story from the flight deck of an aeroplane, I'm going to give you the story from a committee room. The captain in this case was serving two roles. She was captain and she was also the treasurer. She was also the person taking the tickets. So she was looking after the money, but she was also running the meetings. Now, what's important to know here is the end of the story was that this lady went to jail for 6 months for stealing what amounted to $36,000 from a small gymnastics club. $36,000 from a small gymnastics club meant that it was material to that club. It had a long
time ago, so $36,000 had a far greater value too.
Exactly. Yeah. So that money is gone, but then they had to work to replace that money that because they didn't get any of it back because she'd taken it and she'd invested it in the pokie machines. Oh, I'm going to pay it back. I'm going to pay it back. And I will pay it back as soon as I win. As soon as I get my big windfall, then I'll pay it back. And how many times have we heard that? So she's stealing the money and everyone knows. Everyone else on the committee, everyone else was only two more people, a husband and a wife, who were also parents of a gymnast. And what else you need to know is that the pilot was also the head coach. So this power play was despicable because anyone who said anything against this lady, their kids weren't selected in the higher grade. So in moving up in the levels in gymnastics, they were held back because she would hold a personal vendetta against the kid because of the things that the parents said in the meeting. Okay, notwithstanding that this woman should not have been in the employ of this club in the first place, and she certainly shouldn't have been elected to the position of centre manager, read president, read pilot, as well as treasurer. And being president and treasurer is illegal, of course, especially in Queensland where this happened. So none of that should have happened in the first place, but they just let it happen, and they let it happen because, I don't want to say anything. I don't want to ruffle feathers. And then look what happened. Because they didn't speak up and because they didn't say, I have the safety of saying something in this committee, not because I don't like Liz. It's got nothing to do with that. It's because I care about the longevity of this club. So I have to have a safe place to speak up. Yep. I know you've got a story or two. Have you got any you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, interestingly, one that is so similar to that story that it's scary in that it's, it is a large netball association in the greater Brisbane region. There was a lady over the course of, many years who filled alternately the president and treasurer positions, and the amount of money that was stolen was allegedly, kind of something like 10 times what you mentioned. So there was a lot of money that got stolen over the course of 9 or so years. And the thing that upsets me most in every one of these situations, and we picked on a bloke named Kerry last week, who is a guy who stole, hundreds of thousands of dollars.
More than $250,000.
Yeah, from a state sporting organisation, a disability sporting organisation here in Queensland. And in every one of these instances, when the situation becomes public in the media after the fact, you can bet your bottom dollar that one, if not several of the other committee members are going to come out and say something along the lines of, I thought something was wrong. And it happens every time. It's like clockwork. And that's really upsetting for me. And similar to this, analogy that you're drawing with poor communication amongst a flight crew, the reflection, I know I've myself reflected on situations and thought, God, I wish I spoke up. I wish I, spoke my mind at that time. And what I suppose I'm really hoping is that from this discussion, all of our listeners can take a little bit of confidence away to speak up when the time's right. When you got a gut feel, something doesn't feel right, or you feel as though you should speak up, just do it. Just speak up.
Yep. And if you need to give yourself permission to do so, you can just use some of those phrases like, I'd need to speak freely, and I hope that speaking in the safety of the management committee meeting, I can do so where everyone understands that this is about what's best for the club, and it's not designed to be a personal attack on any person, but we all have jobs to do. So as part of my job, I would like to bring to everyone's attention a concern that I have regarding whatever it is. And in that case, both of those cases, it would have been the lack of transparency that we're seeing about the financials. So what is it that you can give us, Madam Treasurer, that gives us the comfort that we, or in your case, President, in my case, Centre Manager as well, that can give us the confidence to know that everything is on track?
And also, just to drill down and touch more on that confidence point, often there's not a sufficient level of understanding amongst all board or management committee members within a not-for-profit organisation that they're equally accountable. And we harp on about this regularly, but the reality is that certainly my advice, you can throw something into the mix, Mick, if you disagree, but I say there is absolutely no reason why every member of a management committee should not have at least read-only access to the bank account and financial software. Yeah. So sure, no need for everyone to be able to get in there and make edits and do reconciliations. Great if the treasurer is sharing the responsibility to an extent that brings that situation about. But everyone's got to be able to just very simply, very quickly get in and confirm for themselves that everything's above board. Everything's okay. We are solvent. And I suppose that then points to that change that we're seeing here in Queensland, where the duties of management committee members will come into line with those of directors of a company, and every single management committee member, not only the treasurer, has a duty to make sure that the club is solvent. A duty to make sure that your organisation is financially viable. And this is often, that burying the head in the sand that I see as well, where people fall back, and certainly in these scenarios that we've been talking about, where lots of money has gone missing over the course of, several years from organizations, the feeling that plausible deniability, where people think, oh, well, if it's all in the treasurer's hands and they do the wrong thing, well, it's not my fault. I can just get myself out of that pickle. Whereas it's actually not at all the case. It's a little bit like getting pulled over for speeding or not having your seatbelt on and saying to the police officer, oh, yeah, but I didn't know that I had to wear my seatbelt. Give that a crack and see how well it goes for you.
Officer, or Your Honour, like you said last week. So, well, it's really interesting, Steve, because what you've just brought up, it paints another parallel between the analogy of the aeroplane and what happens in a club, and particularly among the committee. So
Yep.
you mentioned that having visibility of the financials and the financial reporting system. So on a flight deck on an aeroplane, the captain and the first officer are in the front seats, and they've got in front of them the dashboard. And on that dashboard, they've got all of the gauges that they need that show everything about the aeroplane. So all of the safety lights, obviously the altimeter, the fuel gauges, the pitch, yaw, the roll, where everything is set, the landing gear up and down. So they got clear visibility of everything. And that's exactly what you're suggesting that clubs are giving among their entire management committee. So it's not just the treasurer who's got visibility of the dashboard, the financial dashboard.
Yep.
Everyone should have visibility of that, and everybody does. The navigator, in our case, the secretary, isn't the only one who can see the map and the flight path plotted on that map. The map of your committee meetings is obviously your agenda.
Yep.
Everyone can see the agenda. They know exactly where we're going. They know our launch time. They know our ETA because it's on and they know the journey that we're going to be taking through the agenda to get there by the time we're supposed to be there. If we're going to be a little bit late, then obviously it's like when the captain comes on and says, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Just like to let you know that we're running a little behind schedule and we should be finishing this meeting, read landing the aircraft and having you departing at the gate by about 5 minutes after schedule. I've always wanted to do that. That was fun. But so you can see that parallel. So this is something that we talk about quite a bit, that the dashboard, everything that we can see, all of the systems in a club. So like we talked about last week, all of the things that we talk about in governance training, when you've got all of those done and you've got a good strategic plan, you've got, and I'm not just talking about words on a page here, I'm saying something that actually connects with why we exist and our purpose. And it says, this is where we're heading for the big picture. You've got a budget, you've got an asset management system and a plan for replacement. You're making regular contributions to a sinking fund to replace your assets as they reach the end of their useful life. All of those tools and everything that you can see in your role, those are like the dashboard of the aeroplane. But in all of the cases of the story, the Korean Air flight that crashed in 1997, the flight from Colombia into JFK in 1990 that crashed because, again, poor communication. In this case, the first officer talking to air traffic control didn't let them know that this is an emergency. We are running out of fuel. And the air traffic controller said, "Oh, can you go over there?" And they just did. And the captain said,
"Can you go around again?"
Yes, can you go around again? Go another 15 miles out. So they were crashing on their way away from the airport just because the dude didn't say to the air traffic controller, "This is an emergency. We don't have the fuel to make it." He said, "Thank you, sir." Seriously, he said, "Thank you, sir," to the air traffic controller for saying, "Go back up to 3,000 feet and do another run. Go out to 15 miles out and come back." The captain saying, "Did you tell him that we're running out of fuel?" He said, "Yes, we're running out of fuel." But he said, "We're running out of fuel. We're running low on fuel." Those aren't phrases that signify an emergency. This is an emergency. We do not have the fuel for that. If he had said that, they would have reordered the flight, the landing. Again, bad weather. So we had traffic, lots of planes in a holding pattern. Kind of reminds me of Die Hard too. Lots of planes in the air, and you bring in the ones that are going to crash if they don't come and land. And they would have done that if only I'd said something.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's too late when they've crashed. And in that case, like, that was a pretty good one because only 8 of the 9 flight crew and 65 of the 149 passengers on that flight crashed in 1990. Like, I can't tell these stories without saying I'm just gutted by it. Yeah. But I can't talk about Liz at the gymnastics club or the girl at the Netball Association without getting upset about that as well, because people had an opportunity to speak up, regardless of the fact, Steve, that they had access to the dashboard, regardless of the fact that the aeroplane was in perfect working order. In this case, a gymnastics club and a Netball Association, everything was in perfect working order. So the passengers, the members, didn't necessarily know that anything untoward was happening. Mm-hmm. But like you say, the people who after the fact that they interviewed and say, "Oh yeah, I always thought something fishy was going on," they did. So normally we like to give a few takeaways. Steve, I think we should just give one in this case. Speak up. Use the protection of the management committee meeting in exactly the same way as training since the Air Korea crash, or the Korean Air flight. What was that? 801 it was on the 6th of August 1997 that one crashed. And ever since then, when they recognized that it was because of poor communication among a flight crew that these planes were crashing, and if it's not caused by that, that was a definite and unequivocal contributing factor.
Mm-hmm.
So the training there provides the safety even to the first, to anyone who is on the flight deck, to be able to say, this is not safe, we need to change course or change our actions. Do exactly the same is the main takeaway.
I think importantly there's that agreement that is built throughout, the training of flight crew. So everyone's on the same page. The understanding exists that, there are protocols that we follow. And if the captain's not listening, it gets to the point where the first officer can take over.
Yep.
I think that for me is a little precursor to the takeaway, which is speak up. I think also to set the agreement that everyone can have the confidence to speak up. So, last week, we talked about after each AGM, getting all of the board members on the same page and having a roundtable discussion, whether that's one that you engage, the likes of us to come in and help facilitate by way of an induction training session.
It's like jumping back in the simulator, isn't it, Steve? Every so many hours, pilots need to get back and do more simulator training. They need to get thrown into situations where they don't know something's going to go wrong and work out how to fix it. So absolutely, don't get complacent. Continue to have those check-ins, like you say, by having someone like us come in and run some reminder training, but also having an external third party to say, these are the ground rules by which you need to agree to work in safety, and without then going away and saying, he was angry at me. It's not angry at you. It's trying to make sure that the money's safe, that our kids on the field court or in the pool or on the track are safe. That's what it's about.
Yeah, absolutely. And get to the point as quickly as possible where there's that culture of openness and confidence to speak up, so that should anyone on the committee have a concern or feel the need to speak up, that they know absolutely that they can do so in a safe environment, so that so that there can never be a situation after something's gone wrong where someone says, I didn't know that I had the right to speak up.
Oh, yeah. And look, it's interesting because both of the examples that we've used, I've just thought of something that's a bit more scary. Both of the examples that we've just used have been financial in nature, and money comes and money goes. So yeah, 300 here, 270 there, 36 here, 20 the other. These are all, it's just dollars. Money goes and money comes, money goes, and it's okay, we can get it back. But sometimes people don't speak up when they're concerned for things like child safety.
Yeah.
So it does get as serious here as it does on the flight deck of an aeroplane.
Yep.
Make sure that if you have any concerns, you are setting up. So of course, make sure that the dashboard is right. Make sure in this case that the gauge you've got is the child and youth risk management strategy that you have that very clearly sets out how you're going to behave. Then monitor that and make sure that the whole organization understands it and is acting correctly. But gee, if you've got any concerns, you need to speak up, because it's no good later, maybe in court, to then say, oh, I didn't say anything because I didn't feel that I could because I was worried about getting kicked out of the club or annoying the president.
Someone. Yeah.
Oh. Yes, speak up. And I really like that, Steve. So let's call it two takeaways. Firstly, is set the environment and set an agreed understanding between everyone that this is how we are going to communicate. The next one is speak up. And then I will add a third one, keep on top of it, to keep fit. So go back and check in and have these regular check-ins. So this reminding everyone of the parameters around which our clear, unambiguous communication is built. We have check-ins and reminders and refreshers about that at least once a year. So that was fascinating. It was, you can see that there's a lot of parallels there between what happens on an airline and what happens in a committee meeting, apart from taking the plane crashes out of it. Well, if there were no plane crashes, we'd have no basket case clubs as well. But, that's not necessarily a bad thing if everyone becomes a showcase club. So, Steve, thanks very much for joining me again this week. This has been a really interesting discussion. I look forward to talking about all of those things on the dashboard with you over time.
Yeah,
as well.
I think it's a great analogy, and I'm sure that it will speak to a lot of people who have been involved in situations just like this. And look, I'm confident that every one of our listeners will have experienced a situation like this where they, maybe could have taken a different approach and more openly shared a concern here or there, and resulted in a different and potentially more positive outcome for their organisation. So, good analogy.
Yes,
nice words from Michael Connolly.
And Steve Connolly. So if you're not already following us on social media, make sure that you do that. Subscribe to our newsletter with all of these useful tidbits of information that come out all of the time. And of course, if you want to pick up the phone and give us a call or send us an email, please do so. And keep adding all of your ideas for future episodes of Basket Case Clubs as well. We are getting through them. So for those of you who have submitted ideas, thank you very much and keep doing so. And for those of you who haven't yet done so and thought, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to find out if anyone else is suffering from what we're suffering? What are the other people's pain points around this area? Send it in. We're very happy. And I can guarantee you that when you do, you're not alone. So Steve and everyone else, thank you very much for joining us on this airline today. And we look forward to when you choose to travel with us next time. See ya.